Today is Christmas, and I like to think of this as a day for giving. So we're doing something a little different this week, giving over the podcast to you. I get a lot of questions about what we do here via email, and we asked for even more questions from you on social media. This week, I'm happy to welcome a number of our critics and my colleagues here at the Book Review to give you some answers. So happy holidays from the Book Review podcast. It's December 25th. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us first to answer questions from listeners, two editors many of you are familiar with, Tina Jordan, who is the deputy editor of the Book Review, and Elizabeth Egan, an editor at the Book Review, our group text columnist, and the author of a novel of her own called A Window Opens. Liz and Tina, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela. Thanks for having us.
All right, let's take our very first question. It comes from Ingeborg Moran, and she asks, I'd like to know everyone's thoughts on the Kindle. Has anyone become a Kindle convert during COVID? She writes to us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. All right, Tina.
Ooh, I will say this is a tough one for me because one thing the pandemic has meant for all of us on the books desk is that we're reading everything digitally. And I have zero problem with an e-reader. I actually use an iPad and not a Kindle. If, say, I'm going on vacation, but for constant everyday reading, I will admit it has been a real drag. Liz, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I cannot wait until the day when I'm only holding real books in my hands again.
Tina, I agree. I was actually a very early adopter of the Kindle when it was first invented, and I feel that it serves a purpose and has a place in my reading life. But I feel it is way more clinical than holding a physical book. You're missing the page feel and the smell of the book. I have two very simple tips for anyone who is looking to wade into the world of e-readers. One is to experiment with the font and find one that feels most appealing to you. There are a few fonts on my Kindle that make me just feel, they remind me that I'm reading on a screen. And I have a couple that are more palatable than others. Here's my other tip. When I'm reading a book, I am an underliner and a page folder and an interactor, which is a hard thing to replicate on the Kindle, even though you can highlight. So I put a Post-it on the back of my Kindle and take notes that way. It's not quite as rewarding as dog-earing and taking notes in the margins, but it does allow you to have the same vibe.
Well, you actually raised an important point, which is that on e-readers, you can increase the font size. And for anyone who has trouble seeing tiny print, for example.
No one is in that age category around here, Tina.
I'm thinking of my mother. I hope she's not listening. She uses an iPad now and loves it, because she can make the print big enough so that when she's reading in bed at night, she doesn't have to have her glasses.
I'm surprised neither of you has brought up, for me, the most controversial element of the e-reader experience, which is the percentages rather than pages. I feel like for me that's like the Fitbit. It's sort of both too much information and also not the right information. I feel like it would take me down a very bad path if I were to rely on things like percentages, because I am a finisher and a completist in general, and I do like to check things off, and somehow that percentage thing, I feel like I'd just become very focused on the numbers rather than what you should be focused on when you're reading, which is, the words. Does that not bother either of you?
No, it definitely bothers me. And sometimes mine will say location instead of percent. And it'll say location and then a number. And that is baffling to me. I don't understand it. But I have learned how to use the go-to feature on mine, which allows me to skip around in a book and read the end before the beginning, which I will admit I am prone to do.
Oh, Liz.
I know, don't ask. But the other thing that I find problematic about an e-reader as a reviewer who's reading a ton of books and kind of evaluating a ton of books at once, when I look at something on an e-reader, it reduces my recall. Like I can't remember the name of the author. When I have a book in my hand, I have almost a savant-like ability to connect the title and the author and even the color of the spine forever in my memory.
Well,
But when I
there are
read it,
studies that have shown this to be true, Liz.
it's a disadvantage for me because I can't remember what I've read and I can't place it in the same way, which is also can be a good thing because it gives all books sort of an equal beginning in my mind.
We're going to go to our next question. It's from Haley Ryan. She says, I'm really in a classics kick. I loved Portrait of a Lady. And from the 20th century, I loved Stoner. That's by John Williams. What are the classics that were most impactful to you?
That's an interesting question. I'm going to go with something unconventional that some people might argue is not a classic. And in that case, I will fight you. I'm going to say I Capture the Castle by Jodie Smith, which is this amazing 1948 British coming-of-age novel about a 17-year-old girl in 1934 who's growing up in a dilapidated castle with her sister, her stepmother, and her father, who's an author who I believe has had one successful book and is, suffering from writer's block. And I feel like any summary I would actually give of this book would not make it sound remarkable in any way. The characters are so charismatic. The writing is you know what? It's like Jane Austen transplanted to the 20th century. Let me just say that. Liz, have you read it?
I read it years ago and I absolutely loved it. And I completely agree that it falls into the classics category very easily. I also have a series that I return to again and again, which might not fall into people's traditional classics list, but I go back to Anne of Green Gables again and again. I just love the Anne books, and also a lesser known series by L.M. Montgomery, who wrote Anne of Green Gables, called Emily of New Moon, which some people turn to yoga when they need soothing. I turn to Anne and Emily.
What's Emily of New Moon about?
It has a similar setup to Anne of Green Gables. It's about a young girl in Canada living with her aunt, who is not quite as tough as Marilla of Anne of Green Gables, but she's not a mother. She's not a warm figure. And it's just a coming of age story. I think we meet her when she's about 11. And if you read all the books, you can follow her into her early 20s. And she's not as brave and outspoken as Anne. She doesn't get into as many scrapes as Anne called them, but she is a young writer and has a love of words, and it has this kind of peaceful element to her that I love.
Pamela, how about you?
Well, it's interesting that Haley asked about which ones were most impactful to you. So, that makes me think back to my teens and my 20s, because I think that's when, books sort of affected me most deeply. And it's really hard to narrow it down. I find that every 5 or 6 books or so, I will go back to something from the 19th century. For me, classics are kind of a palate cleanser in a way. It's sort of, especially if I'm reading some recent books that are not great, I feel somewhat depleted, and I want to read something that I just know is really rich and nourishing. Portrait of a Lady was the first book that made me cry, by the end, it just like tears streaming down my face. And it's funny because I'm actually, among other things, reading a book of Henry James right now. And one of the stories in the book, it's really a novella that I'm reading right now, is The Turn of the Screw, which I hadn't read since I originally read it. And it's just a reminder, like, this is really quite good. There is a reason that this story has stuck around, and also that it's inspired so many different adaptations and updates, both on screen and on the page. So I do feel like you can't ever really get too much Henry James. And Dickens is another classic writer. I still haven't read all of Dickens, so I feel like there's still something new for me there. I just bought a copy of Hard Times, which I'm looking forward to reading. Have either of you read that book?
Oh, yes.
Never.
Tina, of course you have. What's your favorite Dickens, Tina?
It's probably Our Mutual Friend. That's a tough one, though.
Like, what are the other contenders?
Great Expectations.
Yeah, Great Expectations is the other contender. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to go on to a third question. It's from Jessie Mitchell. She asks, I'm wondering how I can do what you all do over there. How did you manage to score a job reading for a living? That's my dream. All right.
That's a great question.
It
Tina,
is.
you go
I will
first.
say that Jessie is at the University of Michigan, where she is class of 2022.
That is a great question. And I had such a weird route to this. Of course, it was a long time ago before people went to journalism school, but I got a classics degree. I got a graduate degree in English. I moved to New York City and I went into book publishing, and I didn't love it. And one of the things I really didn't love about it was it moved so slowly. It took forever to get things done. Often a book wouldn't come out until 2 years after you were finished editing it, and it could be longer. And there was so much boring stuff that was involved as well. I wasn't interested in photo sections and indexes and whatever, all those things. And so I started to look around. I really loved books and I loved reading. And I was lucky enough, this was like the heyday of magazines. Time Inc. was starting a magazine called Entertainment Weekly. I think I read about it in the Times, and I just fired off this cold letter to the editor and said, here's what I do. I want to cover books for you. And lo and behold, I got a call a few days later, and I was hired there, and I ran that book section for decades. And it was a real on-the-job kind of training. That was back in the era where if you wanted to be a journalist, you basically apprenticed yourself. People taught you.
That's a magic story, Tina.
Yeah, really is a magic story. Anyway.
Like, who writes a job saying, I want this job, and gets that job? Very few people.
Yeah, it is a magic story. But I think, Liz, isn't yours similar in a way?
It is similar. I actually graduated from college and worked for 1 year at a textbook publisher. And then I went from there to a wonderful book publisher called Workman. But because I was so junior, I mostly only worked on page-a-day calendars, the cat page-a-day calendar, the dog page-a-day calendar, the horoscope.
So I have a calendar background too, weirdly.
What? We've never
yes.
talked about this.
I know. Side conversation one day.
It was excellent experience as an editor because it teaches you to be very detail oriented. Like, you can't have Valentine's Day appear on February 15th. People will be very upset. So while I was working at Workman, I actually placed a phone call, not an email. I called Self Magazine, which is now defunct, but it was a beloved fitness magazine. And I asked them if they were hiring book reviewers. And the person who answered the phone happened to be the assistant to the books editor at Self. And she said, no, we're not looking for book reviewers. But we struck up a conversation. And a month later, that same assistant called me back and she said, I got promoted. Would you like to come in and interview for my job? It was such a fortuitous thing that came from a cold call. So I was hired for the job as the book editor's assistant. And from there, I knew that I wanted to be somebody who read for a living. And in all of my years in women's magazines, I was probably told 100 times that I should specialize in something more practical, like fitness or nutrition or beauty. But really, the only thing I was interested in were books. So I kind of stuck with it and eventually, a year ago, found my way to the Times.
The next question comes from Sheila Golodowicz. She writes from Little Rock, Arkansas, and she says, I have not read one work of current literary fiction. What's the one novel I should read to round out my epic reading year? I should say she prefaced this by giving us a list of all the things she has read, which is very impressive. Everything from Carolyn Weber's Proust's Duchess to Steve Luxenberg's Separate, the story of Plessy versus Ferguson. So she's been reading lots of nonfiction. What novel or work of literary fiction should she read this year? Liz.
This book did not come out in 2020, but I see no reason not to dwell in 2020 for 1 minute longer than we need to. For some reason, looking at Sheila's book list, the book that popped into my head was The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai, which is about the AIDS crisis and the arts community in Chicago in the 1980s. And it absolutely stopped me in my tracks. It's incredibly beautiful and also a window into a world that I was glad to know more about.
Tina?
When I look back at my reading for the year, what I wanted most of all was to escape, to get out of 2020. I loved Tove Jansson's The Summer Book, which was set on an island in the Gulf of Finland. That's an older book. And from this year, I think I would have to say my favorite literary novel was Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet. And it is both a love story and a tale of incredible loss. It's about the 11-year-old son of the world's greatest playwright, presumed to be Shakespeare. The book is set in 1580, I think, and his wife. And somehow escaping to 1580s England, even though, or perhaps because it was during a plague year, I felt some connection. It was completely different, yet I felt a sense of kinship with 1580 for that reason. And I'm not going to say it's an uplifting book. It's a terribly sad book, but reading a novel about grief suited me this year.
I have one more, and Pamela, I'm eager to hear your thoughts. But Sheila, if you're looking for a funny book, I recommend Kevin Wilson's Nothing to See Here, about a woman who is hired to babysit for twins who spontaneously combust when they're upset. It's moving and funny and very, very unexpected. And if you've ever spent time with small children, you'll understand the stress of the potential spontaneous combustion. That's another one I loved this year.
Okay, sorry, I just have to do a quick generational check here. Do both of you remember the That's Incredible segment on spontaneous human combustion?
I do not.
I do not. I'm so sorry.
I'm bringing this to another conversation. Really?
Yes, I never saw it. Did you read Kevin Wilson's book?
I haven't, no. But, Bleak
Pamela, you
House,
would love
of course, has the scene of spontaneous human combustion. I don't know why it's not more widely featured in literature.
Same.
I don't either. It's a great device.
Absolutely.
It's a great device. It's a perfect metaphor. All right, final question. This is from Selena from Portland, Maine. She writes, hardcovers and the year plus during which they're the only printed format available for new books are my pet peeve as a reader. I would buy so many more books if they appeared in paperback right away. I can't stand to invest $30 in a new hardcover that's a physical challenge to read and that I probably won't even want to keep. I'd pay $20 for a first edition in paperback without thinking, and I'd probably do it 10 or 20 times a year as opposed to my couple of yearly hardcovers. I do buy a lot of paperbacks, but too often a book that sounds exciting when it's new has lost its shine a year or two later when it's finally out in paperback. Am I the only one who feels this way? Is this being talked about in the book world, or am I just being ungrateful to an industry with slim margins? I read a lot, and this issue is constantly on my mind.
I have to say that I'm on Selena's side because I find it incredibly irksome for the same reason. I think, $25, $30 is a high price point. And it seems to me an antiquated and sort of leftover, I don't know, thing from decades past when book reviews like ours wouldn't review a book if it were published first in paperback. But I think more books should be published either simultaneously or first in paperback and with just a library edition. I'm not sure why they aren't.
Oh, I could not disagree with you more. I love hardcovers. I love, to me, it's like things coming out in the movie theater versus coming out on, sorry, here I'm going to show I shouldn't even say this word.
Video?
Coming out on DVD. No, I'm not going to say videotape. On Betamax. No,
Betamax.
but streaming. There's something to that process that is very exciting to me. I also find hardcovers often easier to read than paperbacks. I know they're very heavy, and it is a big weight lift, but I do find they hold their spot better when they're open. I find that they're more durable. I often read very long hardcovers, and the paperbacks just get sort of really grotty after a while. That said, I also love a good paperback, and I will sometimes have them in both. I love it when there's a different cover for the paperback. I know. So I guess I love the whole thing. I love both. Liz, what about you?
I definitely prefer a paperback to a hardcover, and I truly do not understand why more books don't come out as paperback originals. And I also would say, don't forget the library. I know for new books, there are often waiting lists, but that's another way to go. So you're not spending $30. But I think that the publishing industry is ripe for a bit of an overhaul in the paperback versus hardcover category. I don't understand the finances of it. I don't understand the decision making, but I love when I see a paperback original.
Well, okay, here's a very expensive alternative, which is that in England, of course, most things are published only in paperback. And I often find it really fun if I happen to be in London to look in bookstores and see the new paperbacks of books that are only in hardcover in the US. And sometimes I'll buy them there. So there's that. All right, we have to end. Liz, Tina, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you, Pamela.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Joining us now for our next segment of questions, John Williams and Parl Sagal. Of course, you're familiar with both of them, but John Williams is not only sort of co-pilot here on the podcast, he also edits the critics for the New York Times. He edits Parl Sagal, Jennifer Salai, and Dwight Garner's reviews. He writes reviews on his own, and he is a staff writer for the Books Desk at the Times. And Parl Sagal, of course, is one of those three daily critics, but she is also formerly a senior editor at the Book Review, and she is a winner of the Nona Balakian Prize for Criticism from the National Book Critics Circle. So, Parl and John, thanks for being here.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, we are going to start with a question from William Dandy, and he actually, he has two questions. I'm going to start with the second question because I'm taking advantage of the fact that Parl went to college in Canada. What are the editor and critic's favorite Canadian lit books and authors, and what was the best Canadian novel of the year?
Okay, first I'd like to say I'm very happy not to be in Montreal right now, as I am every winter, but I miss it. And I didn't really read that many Canadian novels this year. I did review two Canadian memoirs, A Bite of the Apple by Lenny Goodings, which is a memoir of starting up a sort of feminist press, Virago in England, and The Erratics by Vicky Laveau-Arvie, which is, a really strange, ingenious memoir of living with a really impossible mother. That said, I am looking forward to reading this book of, I think it's linked short stories called How to Pronounce Knife. Have you guys read it? It's
No.
by Suvankam Tamavongsa. It just won the Giller Prize, which is sort of Canada's most prestigious literary award. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm generally...
Is she Laotian and Canadian?
She's Thai. She's
Thai.
But she's just Canadian. And I just in general am a big fan of the Canadian press Biblioasis, which put out one of my favorite books of recent years called Ducks Newburyport, which is this immense book told in one sentence and continually sort of puts out really sort of creative, strange, innovative books.
Yeah, I'll second that. Biblioasis is a cool publisher up there. Before this year, I wouldn't have had an answer to this question, really. The first thing that would have come to mind is Miriam Toews, whose last name is Toews, who got a lot of attention for her book Women Talking. Was that this year or last year? Time is really blending together. Last year.
I think I reviewed it last year.
but whose book I really love is a book called All My Puny Sorrows, which is a sort of autobiographical novel about her sister and herself. But then this year I read, as podcast listeners will know, a book called The Jest of God by Margaret Lawrence, who's a Canadian writer of an earlier generation, and it became one of my favorite books. So she's a writer who I think more Americans should know.
She's amazing. I mentioned Lenny Goodings before, the woman who went and started Virago Press in England, and her move was actually inspired by Margaret Lawrence. She was this young woman, Lenny Goodings at the time, living in Canada, very torn about what to do, and she read a book by Margaret Lawrence about a young woman living in Canada, very torn about what to do, who just goes and moves to London and starts a new life. And Lenny Goodings was like, this is as good a plan as any. So the powers of Margaret Lawrence have been
great.
proved in life.
All right, I'm going to continue on an international path here with a letter from Heather Leach from Derbyshire. And she writes, after listening to the September 18th pod and catching your rather throwaway but intriguing comment about British voice and style, I'd be interested in hearing further discussion about how readers and critics in the US or elsewhere might define such a voice style. All right, over to you. Let's start with you, John.
Oh, God. Well, you're making me really miss travel with all of these international questions. This has to come with a giant asterisk, which is even more than the other answers, which is just that, this is very reductive, and it's just sort of my subjective feeling when I hear the words British literature. I'm a huge fan of it, and I think that I associate a kind of high archness and a high style, a kind of more attention paid on the sentence level, I think, than the average American writer. I think of someone like Edward St. Aubyn in terms of a more contemporary person in his Melrose novels. But going back further into time, some of my very favorites like Anita Brookner and Waugh. Yeah, just a kind of a dark comic feeling,
Yes.
even when things are very serious.
Like an amused detachment.
Yes, an amused detachment, a bemusement, and to use a word that I think Dwight used very well recently, a mordancy. And I kind of like that in general. So I like that to me feels like a fairly regular feature over the years in British literature.
We're all going to be speaking with asterisks on this answer. So I just want that caveat to apply for everyone. I think of it as like also this kind of wry, I don't know, resignation, just an acknowledgement of the absurdities of life. It's sort of like, I guess the people that I think of are like Alan Bennett and George Orwell. There's a certain kind of humor.
I thought of Jeff Dyer, too, and he wrote a great, Parle actually gave me this anthology once at work, this was years ago, essays by people who didn't have children. And Jeff Dyer's essay in that book is kind of a perfect example of what I think we're talking about.
Parle?
Yeah, no, I agree, but I'm such a creature of the perverse. I'm automatically trying to think of examples that prove you guys are wrong.
I can come up with
no,
them.
but it's interesting. Like, this is what we talk about. Like, it's so clearly defined by all of us. I would say the same thing, and I would sort of add that notion of the British voice, at least for me, seems also very shaped by British journalism, and especially British criticism. You think about people like Alan Bennett or Zoe Heller, or sort of like the tone of the LRB, the sort of very, again, as you're saying, this archness, this detachment, this sort of chill, this sort of feeling of dampness and failure, all of these things. But it's interesting that, again, as we've all agree, is like a one sliver of that tone, yet it's come to stand in for British literature in a way that, like, we could also say something about Zadie Smith. We could also say Monica Ali. We could say a whole bunch of the writers that have really redefined British literature in a more multicultural age. But that notion of that voice is so strong. And I think it's because it does feel so different and maybe exotic to the American reader.
You brought up Zoe Heller, and it made me think there's this other strain that I really like mostly from British women writers, which is this kind of, I say this in a highly complimentary way, a meanness, a sort of sharpness, a kind of unsentimentality that I associate with Zoe Heller and with Rachel Cusk. And it's not that there aren't feelings there, but there's almost just like this, I guess it's a kind of detachment.
I don't know if I totally agree with you, and I've always wondered about that and why I don't trust it. I really like it, but there's something about it that makes me think that it's also, I don't know, maybe it comes out of British journalism, out of sort of having to be a woman in an acceptable way. Like that tone is more acceptable than, because Cusk is a very earnest and emotional writer, but she's found this sort of tone. Anyway, I could talk about this forever, but I love this discussion because it is such a recognizable tone, and it seems to tell us so much about our tastes as American readers and what we
Yes.
think we're seeing. It's more about us than it is them, I think. And that's so interesting.
Also Hilary Mantel, in her essays, especially and in her autobiographical writing, she has that same kind of Rachel Cusk thing where it's the emotion is all there too, but there's also this, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a clear-eyedness in a way. I mean, sometimes it's a performative resignation, which can be kind of like a contrarian grumpiness or something. But I don't know. The only sort of actual lineage I have in the world, if I have any, is Irish. And, there's obviously sort of an adjacency to the sort of stylish misery. I've always been a fan of it.
Yeah.
But I realize that that's one very small sliver.
I always wanted to be like the disgruntled British person at the party, who just sort of could choose to participate or I don't know.
It's not too late. We support you. It's a safe space.
All right. Here is a question from Therese Hoffman, who writes from West Roxbury, Massachusetts. And it's a perfect question for the two of you, as both of you as critics and editors. I'm curious about how a reviewer goes from reading and rereading an assigned book to actually writing the review. I would also like to know more about the editor's role in working with the submitted review. All right. That's for you guys.
Shall I start?
Yes, you're the writer.
I don't know. I think that nobody really knows how to write. I think you forget how to write, and every week you have to remember again. I feel like I have to relearn how to write an email before I send it every time. But my general process, and it's funny, Dwight and I have the exact same process, which we didn't know until we were talking a few weeks ago, is that we read the book and then we just take, an insane amount of notes. I like to really read around as much as I can in the time I have. Other books that the writer has written, reviews, how they've been reviewed, articles, as much as I can sort of like drink in about this writer, to sort of figure out not only this book, not only to review the book, but to sort of say, where does this book fit in to a life, to a career? All of that's very interesting. I mean, as much as you can smuggle into 800 words, I would like to give a sense, of those things. So you take notes, you write, you rewrite, and then you sort of, you make your case. And I don't know, I think we're all so lucky to work with John, just because he has, he's helpful from every step of it, from choosing what to review to sort of helping us hone our arguments. I mean, he's got such good taste, and he's also very good at gently prodding me to file my pieces. So that is the greatest art of all, is the
gentle prod.
Is it coming today? So, I mean,
that's the classic skill of the editor. That's the number one skill. Just trying to get the stuff.
To extract it from me, I think is always a delight. That's the work of it. But I think the other aspect of it, which is which I think I'm eliding, is the work of thinking, is the work of like actually sitting down and saying, not only what do I think about a book, but why do I think it? Reviewing is such a self-conscious process, especially if you're doing it once a week. You become in very close touch with your own tastes and your own blind spots and your own biases. So there's a lot of that happens when you sit down and review a book and you try to say what makes it work or not work. And I'm putting work in quotations, and you're asking yourself a lot about, what does it mean that something pleases you in this particular way or displeases you,
Since work is in quotations, I want to ask you, does it feel like work to you?
Oh, very much so. I mean, it's a pleasure. Like, I love reading it, but I do feel like a sense of responsibility. I'm grateful for a sense of responsibility, but you do sit down with every book. And I always say this, like, cognizant that this is years of somebody's life, and also cognizant of the fact that there are not that many places that review books. They're used to, I was reading this old sort of article about reviewing in its sort of heyday, and books could be counted on to get 60 to 90 reviews.
Oh God.
Can you imagine?
No.
Right. So it's like we have this, you might be one of the only reviews a book gets, and you really want to do due diligence, not only for the reader, we serve the reader, we don't serve the writer per se, but you also really want to let the writer know, I've sat with your work, I've thought about it, I've read as much of your work as I can, I'm making a responsible and informed case. So that part does feel like the work of the job.
You're hired.
And dealing with me.
All right, John, what do you do? What's your role here, other than the surgical extraction?
I guess I do think of it as a job, but I feel insanely lucky. The three critics, given the space that they have to work in, the ground they cover is kind of extraordinary. And given that it's a newspaper and it's not a 7,000 word piece, the work is, they're all such good writers that the editing it exists, but I'm never reinventing the wheel or sort of trying to get them to do something that is impossible in the amount of time we have. I mean, it's very pleasurable, and they're all such responsive writers too, which is not always the case. In terms of writing, I have a very good short-term memory. And so what I really do is I kind of annotate. I don't write notes so much as I take chunks of the book as I go, either annotating them with my hand or putting them into a document on my computer. And then when I'm done with the book, I go back in and referring back to the book also from time to time, I just sort of structure. I come from like a nerdy argumentative background. So I I try to just structure what I'm trying to say from A to B to C and then put the pieces in place and then sort of flesh it out with my own thoughts and writing. And it's kind of it's a process that's fairly replicable from time to time.
What's a nerdy argumentative background?
Debate. I bet he's talking about debate.
Yeah, I was a high school debater. And it's like, I try to bring that to my editing too in a way that's not too annoying. I'm a stickler for, dropped connections between thoughts and ideas. Not that there are many when these three file, but
God bless you. No,
but that's kind of my my favorite thing to look for.
Okay, the next question is from Ryan Pierce. He says, I'm curious about authors that transcend a genre as they write somewhat within it. For example, I don't seek out science fiction, but I know that Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, and N.K. Jemisin have expanded the field. More preferable, authors of genre fiction that have breakout works that are considered literary fiction. I'm thinking of Georges Simenon's Dirty Snow, which I found through New York Review of Books Classics and thought was chilling and phenomenal. Most preferable, literary authors who visit a genre for a novel or two. I love Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake trilogy. I loved Ishiguro's The Buried Giant, and I love everything Bolaño, even though that's not exactly crime or detective fiction. What are some standouts for you? He writes from Portland, Oregon.
I love the nerdy structure of this email with the sort of tower of preference.
All right, the three tiers.
Yeah, I'll answer this fairly quickly because I don't read a lot of the traditional genre stuff that I think he's saying he's looking to complicate or elevate. And I'm kind of avoiding the question a bit by just saying that I think it's really just about what's on the page. I think of, like, for instance, I do read mysteries from time to time, and I think of people like take Raymond Chandler and Lawrence Block. Lawrence Block has this character I love named Matt Scudder, who's a detective, sort of a private detective, retired cop in New York. And he's got good character. He's fleshed out as a character. He tithes to the church. He's got his drinking problem. He's got his personal relationships. About all that. And Block is funny. But the books are very conventionally mysteries. Something happens in the beginning. There's a crime to solve. He's going to figure it out. He's going to talk to a bunch of people. There's a kind of law and orderness structure to the books. And in Chandler, there's just something stranger. You're not necessarily going for the resolution of the mystery. You're going to it for the writer's style, his observations, the characterizations. And it's kind of an inversion of, you feel glad that Block is good at those things, but that's not the primary pleasure of the books, I don't think. And I assume that applies to other genres, but that's kind of how I think of it.
Carl?
I had the exact same instinct where when I was listening to this question, my mind went immediately to crime writers and true crime writers that, quote unquote, transcend the genre, as if the genre is ever narrow in the first place. And you're talking about crime. Talking about crime is like talking about money or sex. You're talking about everything.
Dostoevsky.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting that those are the people immediately. I thought of Patricia Highsmith is a writer I love, and Patricia Highsmith loved superhero comics and Marvel comics, and you can really read her books as variations of those sort of comics. But there's a real strangeness and in the style and both the depth of her intensity and the depth of her identification with some of the people that she writes about. And I think you can also just tell that she's really gleeful about all the crimes she gets to commit on the page. But people like, people like Highsmith, people like Tana French, who writes these, absolute procedurals, but every book she writes is also a social novel. She's writing about the recession in Ireland. She writes about the housing bubble. She writes about bullying online. Like, she's constantly, within the context of her Dublin Murder Squad novels, bringing in something that's happening in the world and trying to understand it. I think about true crime writers, people like Emmanuel Carrère, who play with the form, but really have to say a lot about authenticity and about authorship. And I was wondering, what is it about true crime and crime as a genre that these people are going into and sort of making these really interesting kind of contraptions. And I wonder if it's sort of the allure of writing about crime anyway. It's sort of, you write about crime and it's sort of, people want to come and look at it. It's made you look. And once you have them, you can take them in all kinds of directions. In terms of sci-fi, I feel like that's another place, sci-fi and fantasy, where there's a lot of beautiful innovation and strangeness. I'm thinking of the Icelandic writer Schon, who has written his Codex trilogy, which are on one level fantasy books. Like they're full of gnomes and creatures, but they're really also books about storytelling, about the collective culture that lives in fables and myths. Ted Chiang, I think, is a writer who, Pamela, you really like, and maybe you could talk about him a little bit because he writes sci-fi novels, right? But they're, they really seem to have a heft and literariness to them, no?
I mean, he says that when he was on the podcast, he explained that he really starts each of his stories with a philosophical question that he doesn't necessarily seek to answer, but certainly to explore. And a colleague of ours actually just sent me an excited note early in this conversation that one of the stories in Ted Chiang's most recent collection, Exhalation, is now being adapted to the screen. And that story is The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, which to me is one of the most profound works of literary fiction I've read in the last few years. And it's really, frankly, about storytelling itself. I'm not going to talk about it for 30 minutes because you know that that's what's going to happen if I go into it. All I will say is read that story to our last letter writer. That was Ryan Pierce. I want to get to the final question. This one comes from Thomas Ehrlich. And this is a question, an issue about which many of us have strong opinions and feelings. And it's a question about strong opinions and a feeling. So I'm going to read from his email. The New York Times often publishes 2 reviews of the same book, and I usually find it helpful to have differing perspectives. But every once in a rare while, the New York Times publishes 2 reviews of the same book that are not just different, but diametrically opposed, with the result that I am left bewildered. This is the case of the 2 reviews of the novel Inside Story by Martin Amis. Both writers claim to be big fans of Amis, but the first review, published on October 20th and written by Paul Sagal, says the book feels built to baffle. It is an orgy of inconsistencies and inexplicable technical choices. The review includes a cascade of negative comments about details in the book. The second review, published on November 1st and written by Tom Bissell — Tom is not here to defend himself — says that Martin Amis is my favorite living writer and Inside Story is his most beautiful book. The review includes scores of positive comments about details in the book. What's a reader to think?
Well, I think I can answer this having written one of those wildly confusing reviews. But I think it is an invitation for the reader to think, And I think that when you have books like Inside Story, where style, and it always like this always seems to happen when style is somewhat the subject of the book. It's never really story that's divisive. It really is a matter of how the story is being told. And you have Amos telling this huge long story, and he's got all of these, strange tricks and ticks, and reviewing is so subjective. And I think, what I was communicating in my review is that part of it is just so nuts, this book. And at the same time, there's some of the most beautiful writing. I think I say this in the review. There's some of the most beautiful writing I've seen Amos do. Those things can coexist. But again, it is subjective. The reviewer makes her case. And we do this with the only evidence the reviewer has, to quote Amos, actually, quotation, So we make our case. We show you what we're talking about. But, this isn't like a clinical trial. We can't tell you if a book works or doesn't work. There's only the experience of sitting with it, how it makes our mind move and think, and we do our best to communicate it with you. And I also think that, that there's part of like the reviewer functions are telling you how this is what I made of the book, and should you go and read it? And I don't know. I think that there's so much of the function of the review that's also just about thinking about books and finding language for it, and not necessarily seeing a book's flaws or excesses. Maybe this is the way I think about it. I don't see them as, I don't think about them as like warding you off from the book, but I want to talk about them in the same way that I'm interested in flaws and excesses in people, And a book like this is so intemperate and it's so stuffed with life. And, that was my feeling. I was like, this is a very, very odd book, a very, very beautiful book. And I loved reading Tom on it. I loved reading, his feeling that all of those choices either didn't matter or felt somewhat necessary. And And I don't know, I think it's part of the pleasure of also working in this office. Remember when we had an office, was disagreeing violently between ourselves,
Yes.
about books. I remember Dwight and I talking about Milkman, a book he couldn't stand and I was obsessed with, and as we talked about it and as he read his review, and then I think I wrote a little bit about it later, it sort of is very telling because it reveals your own criteria, I mean, and the criteria may not always last from book to book. I think books also introduce new criteria to us, but when we disagree about them, you can see something about the reviewer. This is what they privilege. This is what they can overlook. Or this is what the book is allowing them to overlook. There's some power in it that's helping them say that, oh, this thing which I usually feel is so important, be it some aspect of language or character, suddenly doesn't matter. Each book really does cast its own spell, not to sound too moist about it, but it does.
Milkman, I should say, was the Anna Burns novel that won the Booker, right, last
Yeah,
year?
Milkman was one. Oh, Tessa Moshfegh's book. There's so many, all of these books that have a very interesting, powerful, distinctive style frequently divide people in these kinds of ways. And it's endless fun.
I'd like to weigh in with a defensive remark here, too, as the person who sort of, has a vested interest in both of these kinds of reviews. The review that Parl wrote was a daily review by a staff critic. It's a New York Times review. And the Tom Bissell review, which ran in the Sunday Book Review, which is where we go to outside voices, people who either don't work for the Times, or if they do, their fundamental role is not as a book critic for the Times. These sort of two kinds of reviews have the ability to exist in the same news organization because of those two very different roles. And I do want to point to Parl's earlier comment that a book used to be able to count on, getting 60 or 70 or 90 reviews. In this day and age, I feel like we're very lucky to be able to, on occasion, offer 2 reviews of the same book, especially for books, that might not get the same amount of coverage elsewhere.
For a book like Martin Amos's, where you have such a long career, it's a very personal book. There's an endless amount that I feel like I could read about that book. I haven't read the book yet, and I will one day, but I have read those 2 reviews. I've read other reviews. If you sent me another one today, I would read that. And I think that sometimes the institutional thing is the funny thing here, because people see the 2 reviews in the Times and they just see that our name at the top, the company's name. And they almost think to themselves, how could the New York Times feel 2 different ways? But it's quite easy to understand how Tom Bissell and Parl Sagal could feel 2 different ways, because they're 2 different people. So that's the sort of shortest, to me, and most elegant answer, is just that they're different readers and they had different experiences of the book. And that if you read 5, 7 reviews of a book, you're always triangulating those things and, trying to get a sense of what your own taste is versus theirs, or often just have no interest in the book itself, but think the criticism around it is really interesting, which happens to me all the time.
Right. I mean, how rare is it to read a review of a book and then find that you actually agree with that reviewer on every single point?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. My favorite thing is when I disagree with a reviewer, but they're using all my favorite adjectives to condemn the book,
Yes,
then I'm saying,
yes.
this is the one for me. And people tell me the same things about things I write. They're like, I totally disagreed with you about it, but I knew I liked it. I knew this was the one for me. And I think that's also part of it's part of what happens when you have a review that sort of is thinking out loud.
I actually have another variation on that, which is when I read a review of a book, the review is very negative, but I find that rather than feel negatively about the book, I find that I have a very negative feeling towards the reviewer. And I think, I do not like this person or what they think or how they write, and I shall like this book.
I don't think that there's anything more boring or even more sort of against the very idea of criticism than consensus. And so the whole sort of purpose of criticism is it's not to have someone come down from the mountain with the right opinion. It's to have this sort of ongoing multi-voiced dialogue about what it means to read and write.
Hear, hear, John Williams said about disagreement. Parl, John, so fun to talk to you as always.
Thanks, Pamela. Thanks, Parl.
Thank you.
Joining us now, 2 of my colleagues, both of them are editors at the Book Review, MJ Franklin and Dave Kim. Dave is one of the editors here who has an MFA that counts both in his favor and against him. And MJ joined the New York Times from Mashable, where he ran a book club, Mash Reads. MJ, Dave, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
The first question came in via Instagram from Jenny McQueen. And that question is, what books should I encourage my high school students to read in 2021? MJ, we'll start with you.
Oh, what a great question. And I feel like I had trouble reining myself in. And so I wanted to answer this in two ways. First, this is a cop-out answer, but I just want to say like any book that gets them excited. Like in high school did a lot of reading that was assigned and certainly like did a lot of deconstruction and that was great. But I had a lot of teachers who just said like you seem to be interested in blank, not even for an assignment, just like for fun. Here are books that you should read and they recommended like The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and a bunch of like really immersive fantasy series. I remember in middle school, I had a separate book club where I read Fahrenheit 451 for the first time. And so like any book that gets them excited, and there are several YA novels that I just like could not put down when I was reading. They include Camp by Elsie Rosen, Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli, the Children of Blood and Bone series by Tomi Adeyemi. And so that was my first way of answering. My second way of answering is I tried to think of what were some classic high school books and what are some recent contemporary novels that I think kind of align with them. And I came up with two suggestions. The first is I feel like you read in high school The Catcher in the Rye, and it is this like first time you've seen this angry, irreverent, like angsty protagonist. And the book that matches is I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter by Erica Sanchez, which is angsty in such a different way. And I feel like those two paired together can really provide an outlet for students to talk about unreliable narrators, frustrating narrators, and still the experiences of people that are similar or different from you. So there's that. And then the other book that I thought of was remember reading The Invisible Man in high school. And going off of that, I would recommend reading Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. It is such a slim but devastating novel. I think that it's a hard novel for high schoolers. There's so much there, but I think a book that asks readers to reach is always helpful. The protagonists, I think readers will connect with because they're young. It taps into this recent American history that I think is important that we uncover. And it's just a really stellar novel that you sink into. So those are my suggestions. I feel like I could yell on and on and on about books I think high schoolers should read, but I wanted to start there. What about you, Dave?
That was a much more comprehensive answer than I have. I just thought of one book that I read this year, which I really liked a lot, The Undocumented Americans by Carla Conejo Villavicencio. She's writing about big events in American history, but telling the stories of immigrants who are often overlooked and doing her best to capture their voices and personalities with a complexity that we just don't really see enough of. And her voice is irreverent and witty and full of conviction. And I think most grown-ups should read this book too. But the energy of it, the humor, the urgency, all of it seems like it would be appealing to young people, especially. What about you, Pamela?
This is a question that I feel like I could spend all day answering, but I'm just going to very succinctly, with few titles, say that I feel like it's really important for high schoolers to read things in sort of three main categories: books that elicit empathy for people who might be different from them. I think, it's a sort of classic part of adolescence is narcissism and sort of not thinking beyond your own problems. And I feel like one of the great things that books do is open up a world of different voices and different perspectives in a way that you really feel on a sort of gut level. So any book that does that, and I actually think some of the books that both of you two recommended would do exactly that. A second thing that I feel like is really smart for teachers to assign to high school students are books that make them laugh. When high schoolers have so many options for what to do with their free time, and everything is so much fun and so entertaining. I feel like it's important to remind them that a really great book, a really funny book, can make you laugh. I remember reading, for example, Catch 22 in high school and Slaughterhouse Five. They're both serious books, but they have some very funny lines, and actually laughing out loud while reading them was very profound experience for me in high school. And the third category is books that really challenge readers. I think that we often underestimate teenagers and underestimate what they're capable of. And I had one teacher in high school who gave me really difficult modernist books. You know, he assigned James Joyce. We read Portrait of the Artist. He assigned Faulkner's short story collection, Go Down Moses, with a sort of impenetrable story, The Bear. And for me, reading those kinds of books, along with things like The Canterbury Tales or Beowulf in high school, it was like a direct affront, like a challenge. Like, you know, it made me feel like a little less certain of myself, which I actually think is sometimes good for high schoolers who think they know everything, and forced me to realize like that reading is sometimes requires something from the reader, requires a little bit of work, requires an effort to crack a code to get to an understanding. So that for me was also really helpful.
I love that. And especially I love the idea that like the type of work that's required is not the work we associate with high school, which is kind of like sometimes feels tedious or rote. It's kind of like this like mental work to understand. And that's so rewarding. And same for books that make you laugh. Anything that you can connect with on a personal level like that kind of brings you joy and lets you know that like reading is not just schoolwork, but something that really like stretches you and helps you grow and challenges you and makes you laugh. Like, I love that.
Well, that actually leads us right into the next question from John Monday, who writes from New York, Teachers College, specifically at Columbia University. He asks, what books were critical to your development as a person you read or wish you had read while you were in your 20s? So we're getting a little older here. Dave.
I have very distinct memories of reading Nicholson Baker's The Mezzanine in my 20s and being utterly fascinated by it. I loved being able to get lost in the minutia of the world, in a description of eating, pizza with one hand and holding a paperback with the other and sipping soda through a straw, but all written with this very like just hilarious and deadpan voice. He also has no shame, which must be very convenient as a writer. And I think he showed me what you could do, what you could get away with in fiction if you were talented and just honest enough. Lydia Davis also did this for me. My introduction to her began with her story collection, Varieties of Disturbance. But these days, you're much better off just getting her collected stories and leaving it on your bedside table. I think my tastes have changed quite a bit since my 20s, but those are two writers I'll always come back to. What about you, MJ?
For me, I have two. One book is a book that I recommend literally all the time, always. It's always in my rotation, and that is Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. This is a purely emotional 20s recommendation in that I had a friend who's like heard through the grapevine this like kind of like folk wisdom, this phrase that your 20s are your decade of pain. And I so believe that. And Tiny Beautiful Things was like a balm for that decade. The lessons are in it are so universally applicable, which is just like you have to do the work, take care of yourself, be kind, all of these very simple things that I think in your 20s as you're learning and growing just seem so foreign to you. And so having a reminder of that is so helpful and definitely helped me in my 20s. The other book that was so formative for me was Slouching Toward Bethlehem by Joan Didion. Actually read one Joan Didion essay in high school in this very nerdy writing camp that I went did one summer, and that was on keeping a notebook. And I hadn't read any other Joan Didion until my 20s when I read Slouching Toward Bethlehem. And Joan Didion just like, she sees better and differently than everyone else, was my impression that I got after I read that book. She taught me how to see myself, see the world, see other people differently. And she taught me how to characterize them with honesty and style. And that's the word that I keep thinking of too. Like there's a wit and a rigor to how she writes and how she sees. And that is something I always think about as I'm navigating the world now. So those two books, Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed and Slouching Toward Bethlehem by Joan Didion.
It's so funny. Rigor, when I hear the word rigor, my immediate thought is like a thing that I lack. Here is another question. This one comes from a listener in Tirana, Albania. Her name is Eni Mirtolari, and she asks, is the novel as a genre being substituted by nonfiction? Are they completing each other? Is the novel dead already?
Oh boy.
Three tiny little questions about not important things.
I was joking that I love this question because I feel like so far they're like, what book recommendations? Like, recommend books. And then we have this large philosophical question, which is like, what is the novel? What
Is it dead?
the novel? My short answer is the novel being replaced by nonfiction? No. Dave, you pointed this out. We were talking a little bit earlier that this is a question that always comes up. But one of the things I wanted to point out is when we composed our 10 best list, like in the end of our 10 best, we had two books that we talked about were just really great novels, really great stories that you sink into. And remember, we talked about that for The Vanishing Half and then for Deacon King Kong. And I just, a good novel and a good story, I think, will never die. What about you, Dave? What do you think?
Oh, the novel's absolutely dead. I mean, it's been killed off by every generation since, the tale of Genji in 11th century Japan. I mean, I think it's high time someone wrote, the 10,000 word essay about this somewhere. I mean, what's it been, like 3 years? I mean, it's every generation. I think we get that question. And no, the novel is of course subject to trends and changing tastes, just like everything else. And I think there's such a growing number of popular texts that blur the boundary between fiction and nonfiction. And so perhaps the distinction is becoming less relevant, but I don't think we're in any great danger of losing the novel altogether. One of the book reviews I edited this month was Judith Shalansky's An Inventory of Losses, which is kind of a catalog of various artifacts and animals and places that no longer exist. And I had kind of a hard time figuring out what to label it. Every book review we publish online has a little label above the headline, saying whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And I spent quite a while going back and forth. And I ultimately went with fiction only because the publisher, New Directions, printed the very unhelpful label fiction/essay on the galley.
That's terrible.
Yeah. So I figured, if even some of it is invented, then the whole thing should probably be called fiction because, we tend to have a purity test for nonfiction, especially now with such scrutiny over facts. So books need to be completely true to carry the distinction. But for everything else, there's fiction. It's a very warm and welcoming club. So I don't think the question is so much, is the novel dead, more than is everything becoming a novel?
One of the things I was interested, though, in this question, Dave, you mentioned that like every generation kills off the novel, but the way this question was posed was, is the novel being replaced by nonfiction? And I think that's such an interesting approach and an interesting way of looking at these forms. And I think it says a little bit more about nonfiction, honestly, than it does about the novel. And I think what it says is the very captivating narrative nonfiction that's coming out that reads like fiction. I'm thinking of books like Say Nothing, of Hidden Valley Road, books that borrow this novelistic form in order to pull readers into these very complex topics. And I think this question is kind of born out of that. Not that the story is going away, but that these genres, these boundaries, these forms that we kind of keep separate are now merging.
I agree with you, MJ, that narrative nonfiction is sort of, tugging at the attention of readers of fiction. And on the other end, memoir pulling away. I guess people get worried when writers who are known as primarily as novelists suddenly come out with a memoir and they think, uh-oh, are you giving up?
Pamela, I'm curious what your thoughts are about the state of the novel.
Well, look, if the novel's dead, then so are we. So I get asked all the time, if the book is dead, if the internet and video games are just sort of too much fun to compete with. But I think that humans love storytelling, and I think that books are the best vehicle for storytelling, better than films and TV, even though I love both of those things, because in the novel, the reader is creating the story, is writing the story as much as the author is. In a film version, you're getting so much of the storytelling delivered to you via all the senses, by the cinematographer, by the actors, by the sound effects, by all the visual aspects. Whereas in books, the reader is creating that story alongside the author, and every reader reads books in a different way, which is why, of course, reviews are so different from one another. We're all reading ourselves into the books. And so I think for that reason, the experience of reading a story, reading fiction, reading a novel sticks with readers in a way, and has a kind of more profound effect on them than other forms of storytelling, because the reader was part of the creative process. So I'm not worried. Is my short answer.
The novel lives.
The novel is alive.
Long
Okay,
live the novel.
here's another question. This one comes from Deborah Freeman. She says, I've been having trouble concentrating the last few months for obvious reasons and find myself reading more short stories than usual. Can you and your colleagues recommend a few favorites, not anthologies, but individual titles? So far, my favorite is Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. MJ, you want to start?
Yes. Oh, I love this. I love this question because I love short stories and I want more people to be reading more short stories. And so I'm happy to share some recommendations. I have recommended this book many, many times, but Delicate Edible Birds by Lauren Groff is one of my all-time favorite collections. And I actually was recommended this by a bookseller from Three Lives and Company who had seen me come in many times and was like, I think based off of what you purchased, you'll love this book. And they were totally correct. So Delicate Edible Birds, and then also Florida. I think Lauren Groff does so many things well, but one of the things she does is, I think, write anger and discontentment particularly well. And those books definitely capture that. The other book that I wanted to recommend was The 10th of December by George Saunders. I was given this book as a gift by my brother right when it came out, and George Saunders' writing is it's so unique. The plots that he sets up are so sometimes alarming, sometimes speculative, sometimes just like so deeply human. But the characters and how they navigate these kind of out of this world scenarios are so heartfelt, and the way he writes, I'm like speechless, which is what this book did to me. So 10th of December is the other book that I would recommend. What about you, Dave? Any short story collections that you'd recommend?
I actually thought of individual short stories, and one I think about a lot is The Tree Line, Kansas, 1934 by David Means. It was in the New Yorker several years ago, and if you don't have a subscription, it's definitely worth burning one of your online freebies for it. It's about an FBI agent remembering a stakeout he'd done years ago with a younger agent, just kind of waiting on a farm for a wanted man to come back. And the blend of this almost clinical investigative voice, plus the author's just truly gorgeous descriptive writing, is really a perfect combination. It's pretty short, and if you want, you can actually listen to Thomas McGuane reading it on the New Yorker Fiction podcast. It has a great ending. In fact, I mean, I dare anyone to write a better ending than this one. And the title again is The Tree Line, Kansas, 1934 by David Means. Another one I love is The End of the Game by Julio Cortázar. This is about a group of girls who invent a game pretending to be statues to try to impress a boy who passes them on a train every week. And one of the girls has a physical disability, so this is one of the few games she can excel at because she doesn't have to move to do it. And it'll just put a real lump in your throat, but it's also a very funny coming of age story that's just stayed with me through the years.
Can I recommend an individual short story as well?
Yes.
Which is so from Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. The opening story in that collection is a story, The Finkelstein Five, and it is about basically these 5 kids were murdered by a man with a chainsaw, these black kids. And after a trial, the man was acquitted because he said he felt threatened. And it's definitely coming off of a lot of the brutality that young black people face every day. And from that premise that these kids were murdered by this like man in this way that's like indisputable that it was murder and not self-defense, and that man was still let off. It's about what happens and the rage of the people in this town. And I just got complete chills reading this short story. It's so smart and so affecting. I highly recommend it.
I'm going to go from Dave's comment about endings in the David Means story to a final question from a listener in Belgium. Marijke van Giel writes, do you have book recommendations of books that have a well-written ending? All right, Dave, you're going to have to find something else. I'm often disappointed about book endings. Too fast, too predictable, too lazy, too open. Not so easy to please me. Often the way a book ends overshadows my overall feeling about the book. A good or bad ending can really make or break my experience. I am with Marijke on this. What do you think, Dave? Any other good endings beyond the David Means?
I'm the wrong person to ask just because I love ambiguous endings. I don't mind when an author like leaves threads hanging or ends something just unpredictably. I definitely am frustrated, just like the listener, when endings don't feel earned, but I'm not a big fan of like pat conclusions with nice bows around them. Trust Exercise by Susan Choi has probably one of the strangest and best executed trick endings I've read in recent memory. This is a book that's constantly throwing you off and revealing new layers right up until the final pages. And I just remember letting out an audible whoa when I finished it. And I can't recommend that book enough. But I suspect this reader is not talking about something like that. I try to think of like the best conventional like bow tie ending and, you know, what can top Gatsby with like the boats against the current. But a couple of titles that I read this year, Edmund White's A Saint from Texas has a nice bittersweet ending to it. Ian McGuire's The Abstainer has a classic, dark, almost biblical ending. And Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, which is a short novel about 2 Palestinian women separated by several decades, but who mirror each other in really interesting ways. Those had some really nice endings. MJ?
I'm like you, Dave. I don't mind an ambiguous ending at all, and I really like them because then speaking of what Pam said earlier about like the reader writing the story as they go along, it allows me to continue that act of creation when you're reading when there's an ambiguous ending. But 3 books that I think have great endings. The first I wanted to mention, this came out a few years ago, was Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday. There's in the very, very last section, there's just this like small, like if you're reading fast, you might miss it line that makes you rethink the entire book. And it made me, after I finished the book, I wanted to start over and read it again with this new context. It's such a good ending, in my opinion. The other that I wanted to recommend is Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. What I like about this book is that it sets up a core mystery of who killed Jean McConville. Then it kind of goes into the history of the IRA and these characters in Northern Ireland, so much so that you forget what that mystery is. And when it kind of doubles back down on it at the end of the book and reveals the answer, it's it's mind-blowing that like all of the clues were there all along, all of the answers were there all along, and you just like didn't realize it because you were so absorbed in this book. And the ending, in my opinion, is so rewarding. And the last ending that I wanted to shout out was There by Tommy Orange, which ruined me, and that's all I'll say about that. So
Excellent. I love talking about endings without spoilers, and let us end there. MJ, Dave, so much fun talking to you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having us.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.